Chapter 1. The House of Whispers. The gates of Vale Manor moaned a final metallic complaint as they closed behind the taxi. Aria paid the driver, her hand steady even as a tremor worked its way up her spine. She told herself it was just the autumn chill, the kind that sinks deep into your bones and stays there. But she knew better. It was the house. It stood on the hill like a blackened tooth, a gothic silhouette against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Stone walls, slick with a perpetual dampness, were crawling with ivy that looked more like skeletal fingers than any living thing. The air itself was heavy here, thick with the scent of wet earth, dying roses, and something else. Something ancient and lonely. This place didn't just have history, it was drowning in it. Consequently, her first meeting with Alara Vale was a study in quiet decay. The matriarch of the family was a bird-like woman, lost in the suffocating grandeur of a four-poster bed. Her skin was thin, like parchment stretched over delicate bones, but her eyes held a surprising warmth, a flicker of a long-forgotten fire. They were a startling shade of amber, and they followed Aria's every move with a sad, knowing curiosity. "You have a gentle spirit," Alara whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Aria simply offered a small, professional smile, the one she'd perfected over the years. It was a mask, a wall, a necessary lie. Because gentleness was a luxury she'd burned out of herself a long time ago, right along with hope and fate and all the other pretty words that only existed to break you. In the days that followed, Aria fell into a sterile routine. She administered medication. She read poetry aloud in a monotone voice. She ensured Alara ate what little she could. The work was simple, but the atmosphere was anything but. The few other staff members moved through the cavernous halls like ghosts, their conversations dropping to hushed whispers whenever she drew near. They spoke of a curse, a darkness that clung to the Vale men, making them more beast than human. Aria dismissed it as local superstition, a way to explain away the suffocating grief that permeated the very stone of the manor. Yet, she couldn't completely shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following her from the shadowed corners and empty portraits that lined the walls. Moving through the echoing corridors felt like walking through a forgotten memory. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, expectant hush, the kind of silence that waits for a scream to break it. The West Wing was forbidden territory, its oaken doors bolted and chained. The staff said it had been that way for years, ever since the last tragedy. Aria didn't ask what tragedy. She didn't want to know, because her life depended on not knowing, on not feeling, on not remembering the night her own world ended in a flash of silver and a scream that was her own. She was here for a job, a way to keep moving so the past couldn't catch up. What do you do when the monster you're running from isn't behind you but inside you? This new reality was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place so devoid of life she could finally be numb. But the house wouldn't allow it. At night, it came alive. The old building would groan and settle, its timbers sighing like a tired old man. But there were other sounds too. Sounds that didn't belong. Tonight was different. A storm was clawing at the windows, and the wind howled a mournful song through the eaves. Aria lay in her small, sterile room, trying to read, but the words wouldn't settle. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Then another. She held her breath, listening. It was nothing. It was always nothing. Except then she heard it. It started as a low vibration, a rumble that seemed to come from the very foundation of the manor. It grew into a growl, a deep guttural sound of pure, undiluted agony. It wasn't the sound of any animal she knew. It was too full of rage, too laced with a pain that felt almost human. It came from the West Wing. The sound was a raw, physical thing that scraped against her nerves and made the dormant part of her, the part she kept chained and buried, stir in its sleep. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. "It's the wind," she told herself. "It's just the old house." But the wind didn't have a voice. and the wind didn't whisper her name. Aria. The whisper was right there, in the room with her. A soft, breathy sound that was somehow more terrifying than the growl. It curled around her like smoke, intimate and impossible. Her eyes snapped open. The room was empty. The door was still locked. But the whisper lingered in the air, a chilling promise of something terrible and unknown, something that knew her in this house of secrets. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Return. The next morning, the air in the manor was charged, humming with a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. The growl was gone, the whisper had faded with the dawn, but the feeling of being watched had intensified tenfold. It was a physical pressure against her skin, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck. Aria tried to ignore it, focusing on the simple, grounding tasks of her job. She helped Alara with her breakfast, the older woman's amber eyes seeming to hold a new depth of pity. It was as if she knew something Aria didn't, a secret that hung in the silence between them. The staff scurried about with their heads down, their usual whispers replaced by a stark, fearful quiet. Something had changed, or rather, someone had come home. He didn't use the bell. The massive front doors of the manor were thrown open with a percussive bang that echoed through the entire house like a gunshot. The sound made Aria flinch, a splash of hot tea sloshing over her hand. From her position in the upstairs sitting room with Alara, she had a clear view of the entrance hall below. A man stood there, framed by the stormy gray light. He wasn't just tall, he was a presence, a force of nature that seemed to suck all the air and light from the space around him. Broad-shouldered and dressed in dark, functional clothing, he was a predator brought into a house of fragile antiques. Rainwater dripped from his black hair, tracing paths down a face that was all hard angles and severe lines, a face marked by a thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was the storm-made flesh. Furthermore, it wasn't just his size that commanded attention. It was the aura of absolute, lethal authority rolling off him in waves. The two staff members in the hall froze, their faces paling as they bowed their heads in submission. This had to be him. Ronan Vale, the Alpha heir. He moved with a lithe, dangerous grace, his heavy boots making no sound on the marble floor as he began to climb the grand staircase. He took the steps two at a time, his movements economical and purposeful. He was hunting for something. Aria's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had a sudden, irrational urge to run, to hide. It was the same instinct a rabbit feels when it scents a wolf on the wind. She remained frozen, however, standing beside Alara's chair, a teacup trembling in her hand. When he reached the landing, he paused, his head tilting as if catching a scent. His gaze swept the hallway before finally landing on the open doorway of the sitting room. His eyes, a startling molten gold, found hers. And the world stopped. For Ronan, the man, it was a moment of stark confusion. Who was this woman? This stranger standing beside his mother, with her calm face and the scent of night-blooming jasmine and something wild he couldn't place. But for the beast that lived under his skin, it was no confusion at all. It was a cataclysm, a soul-deep, world-shattering recognition that ripped through him with the force of a physical blow. The air crackled. The beast rose, snarling, possessive, a primal roar of pure, unadulterated instinct. It saw the woman, and it knew only one thing, one word, one absolute truth that eclipsed everything else. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary vibration of fury and want. His eyes, they flashed, the gold intensifying into a blazing, inhuman light. Aria felt the change like a drop in pressure, the air growing thick and heavy with a terrifying predatory energy. He was looking at her, but it wasn't him looking, it was something else. Something ancient and feral, looking out through his eyes. He hated what he was feeling, this sudden violent pull towards a stranger. He had sworn off this path. He had buried his heart. He would not be chained again. He took a half step into the room, his hand clenching into a fist so tight the knuckles turned white. His jaw was a hard line of control, a desperate battle against the animal clawing at the inside of his skin. Mine. The word wasn't spoken. It was a psychic shockwave, a possessive claim that echoed in the deepest, most dormant part of Aria's soul. It was his. It was the beast's. It was a brand on her spirit. Ronan flinched back as if struck, a snarl tearing from his lips before he could stop it. He spun on his heel without another word, his powerful form disappearing down the hall, the sound of a door slamming in the west wing shaking the very walls of the manor. Aria was left trembling, the teacup shattering on the floor as she gasped for a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The golden inferno of his eyes was burned into her mind, and a single impossible word was screaming in the silence of her own head. Mine. Chapter 3. Hunter's Moon. The nights after Ronan's return became a new kind of torment. The manor, once just lonely and oppressive, now felt like a cage with a predator pacing just outside the bars. Sleep offered no escape because her dreams were haunted by the image of molten gold eyes and a feeling of being hunted. Aria began triple-checking the lock on her bedroom door, a flimsy piece of brass that felt utterly useless against the kind of presence she felt stalking the halls. Twice she woke in the dead of night to find her door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness inviting the terrors of the house into her room. She knew she had locked it. She was certain of it. In addition to the physical evidence, a constant, unnerving sensation of being watched followed her everywhere. It was a weight on her shoulders, a cold spot on her neck that made her hair stand on end. Downstairs, the pack members, the few groundskeepers and security personnel she saw, observed her with a new kind of intensity. Their gazes were no longer just curious. They were a mixture of fear and outright hostility. It was clear they sensed the shift in their alpha. His scent, they would later say, had become thick with the storm of obsession, a dangerous current of possessiveness directed at the new caretaker. Why did he stalk the halls at night? What was it about this human girl that had unchained the beast he'd kept so tightly leashed for years? One night her fears were given a face. As she walked from the kitchen with a glass of water, a movement at the far end of the long, portrait-lined corridor caught her eye. It was him, Ronan. He stood as still as a statue, a silhouette cloaked in the deep shadows between moonbeams. He wasn't moving toward her. He was just watching, waiting. The intensity of his stare was a physical thing, a touch that burned even from 100 feet away. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, just once, and he was gone. Vanished into the oppressive darkness as if he were never there. That was it. This was real. She wasn't losing her mind. Every rational instinct screamed at her to leave. Pack her single bag, walk down the long, winding drive, and never look back. Because this was a danger she recognized on a cellular level, a familiar dance with a beast cloaked in the skin of a man. But as fear clawed at her, something else stirred in the deep, quiet place where she'd buried her own wolf. It was a flicker of something. Not warmth, not yet, but a pull. A magnetic, terrifying curiosity that whispered, "Stay." It was a battle inside her. The woman who wanted to live fought against the dormant wolf that wanted to be found. She wanted safety from the world. She wanted peace from her memories, and she wanted freedom from the beast inside. The decision was taken from her hands a few nights later. A shrill, panicked cry cut through the suffocating silence of the manor. Ilara. Aria's training took over, and she was running before she even thought, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floors. She burst into the matriarch's chambers to find the old woman slumped in her chair, her face a ghastly shade of gray, her breaths coming in short, rattling gasps. At that exact moment, Ronan slammed into the room from his own adjoining door, drawn by the same desperate sound. He was a nightmare given form. His control was gone, shattered by the sight of his mother's distress. A feral snarl was etched onto his face, his teeth slightly elongated, his golden eyes blazing with untamed power. The beast was surfacing, a creature of pure protective instinct and mindless rage. The staff who had rushed in after them froze in the doorway, paralyzed with terror not for Alara, but of their alpha. He was losing himself to the change, the air around him crackling with raw, violent energy. Just as a guttural roar began to build in his chest, Aria pushed past him, her focus entirely on the dying woman. "Help me get her onto the bed," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. As she moved, her scent, that unique, inexplicable blend of night-blooming jasmine and wild ozone, washed over him. It hit the raging beast like a physical blow. The roar died in his throat, choked into a rumbling growl. The feral rage in his eyes faltered, replaced by a dazed confusion as his senses were flooded with her. The beast was still there, snarling and fighting for control, but her presence was like a soothing balm on a raw nerve, an anchor in the storm of his fury. He watched, momentarily stunned into stillness, as she worked, her hands moving with a calm efficiency that defied the chaos. His wild gaze locked onto her and the fight inside him shifted. The beast didn't want to rage. It wanted to claim. It wanted to pull her close and cover her with its body, to surround itself with the only thing in the world that could grant it a moment's peace. He stared at her, the man and the monster both, with a dawning, horrified clarity. She wasn't just a caretaker. She wasn't just a woman who smelled of home. She was a key to the lock on his cage, and he had no idea if she was meant to open it or destroy it completely. Chapter 4. The Mark of the Beast. A fragile quiet settled over Vale Manor in the days following Alara's collapse. It was not peace, but the held breath before a scream. Ronan was a ghost, a phantom of fury that Aria felt more than saw. She would catch a glimpse of his broad shoulders disappearing down a corridor or feel the weight of his stare from a shadowed doorway, a constant, unnerving pressure that made her skin crawl. He avoided her, yet his presence was a smothering blanket of intensity. He was a storm circling just off the coast, and Aria knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was going to make landfall soon. She focused on Alara, whose recovery was slow but steady. The work was a shield, a fragile wall of routine she built around herself, brick by painful brick. Because of her service, Ronan announced a formal pack gathering in the grand hall. Attendance was not optional. He summoned Aria under the guise of publicly thanking her, but the moment the words left his mouth, a cold dread coiled in her stomach. This was not a celebration. It was a stage, and she was the main performance. Walking into that hall felt like stepping into a den of wolves because that's exactly what it was. Dozens of them stood in tight, suspicious clusters, dressed in fine clothes that did little to hide the raw, predatory power beneath. Their eyes, all shades of gold and amber and brown, tracked her every move. The air was thick with the scent of pine, old leather, and a simmering aggression that was aimed directly at her. She was an outsider, a weak, human thing in a room full of monsters. From his position before the massive stone fireplace, Ronan was every bit the Alpha King. Yet, for all his commanding stillness, Aria could see the cracks in his armor. A muscle jumped in his clenched jaw. His golden eyes, burning with a feverish light, kept snagging on her, holding for a fraction too long before tearing away. He was a man on a wire, and the wire was about to snap. It was a tall, silver-haired man named Cassian who gave him the final push. He stepped forward, his voice a smooth, condescending drawl. "It is generous of you, Alpha, to honor this human." He said the word like it was a disease, but her continued presence seems to be a distraction. That was it. The trigger. The world narrowed to a single terrifying point. Ronan didn't speak. He moved. The shift was not a full transformation into a wolf, but something far more terrifying. It was a violent, horrifying blend of man and beast. His face elongated, his teeth sharpened into fangs, and black claws ripped through the tips of his human fingers. He crossed the 20 feet between them in a single, impossible blur of motion, a blur of fur and fury. The pack gasped as one, a collective intake of shocked breath. He was on her before she could even think to scream. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her flush against his chest, a body that was now inhumanly hard and hot. His other hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, and a sound ripped from his throat, a deep, possessive sound that was half groan, half snarl. He wasn't breathing her in. He was devouring her scent. She was paralyzed, her mind screaming while her body refused to move, trapped in the eye of his personal hurricane. He lifted his head, his eyes blazing with a feral, mindless light. The man was gone. Only the beast remained. He grabbed her left arm, his claws digging into her skin, and raised her wrist to his mouth. Aria's heart stopped. No, she thought, a silent plea. His fangs, white and sharp, descended. A searing electric pain shot up her arm as his teeth sank into the tender flesh of her wrist. It was a fire that burned through every nerve, but beneath the agony was something else. A shocking, impossible jolt of pure energy, a current of golden light that slammed directly into her soul. He pulled back, a drop of her blood on his lips. His eyes were wide now, the feral haze receding, replaced by a dawning, shattering horror. The beast had done it. It had claimed her. In front of everyone. Aria stared at the twin puncture marks on her wrist, at the blood welling up around them, and the world tilted on its axis. The whispers of the pack crashed over her, a wave of accusation and disgust. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through the shock. She ripped her arm from his grasp, turned, and fled the great hall, the sound of her own ragged sobs chasing her down the cold, empty corridors. And as she ran, a voice, clear as a bell and deep in her mind, whispered a terrifying truth. You were never meant to hide. Chapter 5. The Alpha's Decree. In the cold sanctuary of her small room, Aria pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. The bite on her wrist was the epicenter of her world, a throbbing, burning wound that felt more like a brand than an injury. It wasn't just the pain. It was the violation, the public spectacle of it all. He had marked her. Like an animal. Like property. She splashed cold water on the wound, watching the blood swirl down the basin drain. But this was no ordinary wound. As the bleeding slowed, the skin around the two deep punctures began to shimmer, a faint, silvery pattern starting to bloom just beneath the surface, like frost on a window pane. It was a mark of magic, a claim made in front of his entire world, and a stain she feared she could never wash away. Her shame was soon joined by fury. A sharp rapping sound at her door signaled the arrival of a delegation she had no desire to face. It was Cassian, the silver-haired wolf, flanked by two other grim-faced pack members. They didn't ask to come in. They simply entered, their presence filling her small room with an aura of judgment and intimidation. The Alpha is compromised, Cassian said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't even look at her, instead focusing on the offensive mark on her wrist. You have done something to him, some kind of human witchcraft. Aria stared at him, incredulous. I did nothing. You exist, another elder snarled, a woman with eyes as hard as chips of flint. Your presence has driven him mad. For the good of the pack, and for his own sanity, you will be gone by sunrise. Before Aria could even process their ultimatum, the doorway darkened. Ronan stood there, a figure of barely contained rage. His golden eyes were chips of ice, and the air around him vibrated with a low, menacing growl that made the floorboards tremble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Get out, he commanded, the two words laced with enough power to make the formidable elders flinch. They scurried away like chastened dogs, leaving Aria alone with her captor. He wouldn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the wall behind her, his jaw tight with a conflict that was tearing him apart. You will not leave, he stated, his voice a flat, hard thing. It was not a request. It was a decree. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You marked me, humiliated me, and now you want to keep me here as your prisoner?" "I am keeping you here because you are safe," he bit out, finally turning his furious gaze on her. "They think you are a witch who has cursed me. What do you think they will do to you if you step foot outside these walls?" He was protecting her, yes, but he was also caging her. He hated the silvery mark on her skin, a visible sign of his loss of control. But the thought of any other man, any other creature, even looking at it sent a wave of possessive, murderous rage through him that was so strong it made him dizzy. Later, shaken and trapped, Aria sat by Alara's bedside. The old woman reached out, her cool, dry hand covering Aria's. Her amber eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "Please," Alara whispered, her voice fragile. "Try to forgive him. He is not a cruel man, only a broken one." Aria said nothing, simply staring at the intricate, glowing mark on her wrist. What could possibly have broken a man with so much power? Alara seemed to read her mind. Her next words were a bombshell that shattered Aria's entire perception of the ruthless alpha. "He's been sick," the matriarch murmured, her gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "A sickness of the soul. He's been this way ever since the night his mate died." Chapter 6. The Golden Leash. His mate died. The words echoed in the hollow spaces of Aria's mind, a relentless, confusing drumbeat. Ronan Vale, the terrifying alpha who had claimed her, had a mate. A dead one. The knowledge didn't soften her fear, but it complicated it, twisting it with a sliver of something that felt dangerously like understanding. It explained the pain she saw warring with the fury in his eyes. It explained the forbidden West Wing, a shrine to a ghost. But it explained nothing about her. Why her? Why had his beast reacted to her with such impossible, soul-deep recognition? The questions were a poison, and the only antidote was distance. She had to leave. Now. Consequently, she made her decision in the pre-dawn gloom. She packed her single worn bag with the few belongings she owned. There was no grand escape plan. She would simply walk out the front door and keep walking until the suffocating presence of Vale Manor was nothing but a bad memory. She was a survivor. She had survived worse than this. She had survived the death of her own soul after all. This was just another monster to run from. She moved through the sleeping house, a ghost in her own right, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. He was waiting for her in the grand entrance hall. He wasn't leaning against the wall or sitting in a chair. He stood in the very center of the marble floor, a sentinel of muscle and shadow, as if he had known she would come. He had been waiting for her all along. "I told you." His voice was a low, quiet rumble that was more terrifying than any shout. "You are not leaving." "This isn't protection," she shot back, her fear making her bold. "It's a prison." "Then it is a prison where you will at least stay alive," he countered, taking a step toward her. "The pack is unsettled. Cassian believes you are a sorceress here to steal my power. Outside these gates, you are prey." He spoke the truth, but it was a truth that served his own purpose, his own possessive, inexplicable need to keep her close. To prove his point, or perhaps to test the very thing that was tormenting him, he did something unexpected. He turned and walked away from her, deliberately putting a long stretch of the cold marble floor between them. The moment he did, the world went white with pain. The silvery mark on her wrist exploded. It was not a burn. It was an agony of the soul, a fire that raced up her arm and into her chest as if a vital part of her was being ripped away. She cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, and crumpled to her knees, clutching her arm. Instantly, he was there. He closed the distance in a silent, lightning-fast blur, dropping to one knee in front of her. The agony was already receding, the closer he got. When he was a foot away, it was just a painful throb. He hesitated for only a second before his hand, surprisingly gentle, closed over her marked wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, the pain vanished. completely. It was replaced by a dizzying wave of warmth, of rightness, of connection, a golden energy that flowed from him to her, silencing the screaming of her nerves. They both stared down at his large, calloused hand covering the glowing mark on her wrist, their breaths held in a shared moment of horrified wonder. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He had no answer. He looked as stunned as she felt. The mark wasn't just a claim. It was a chain. A physical, magical leash that bound them together. They could not be apart. He was her jailer, and she was his, and neither of them knew the nature of their prison. Later that night, defeated and trapped in a cage with invisible golden bars, Aria stood before the small antique mirror in her room. She stared at her own reflection, a pale, haunted stranger with too many secrets in her eyes. She looked at the silvery, intricate mark on her wrist, a beautiful and terrible tattoo that glowed with a soft, ethereal light in the darkness. As she watched, mesmerized by the magic she could not understand, something impossible happened. Her own eyes, the plain, brown eyes she had known her whole life, flickered. For a single, heart-stopping second, they flared with the same impossible molten gold as his. A sharp, terrified gasp escaped her lips. The monster wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It wasn't just the alpha with the broken heart. It was inside her too, and it was waking up. Chapter 7. The Cage of Proximity. The world had shrunk to the length of an invisible chain. Aria's terrifying flash of golden eyes had become a secret she guarded with every breath, a sign that the monster she was running from had finally caught up. The bond, the terrible, magical mark on her wrist, was now the warden of her new reality. If she moved more than 100 feet from Ronan, the gentle thrum of the connection would twist into a sharp, insistent ache. A few feet more, and the ache became a fire, a soul-deep agony that threatened to tear her apart. They were prisoners, shackled together by a force neither of them understood. This new arrangement was a special kind of hell, a constant, simmering torture of forced intimacy. As a result, Ronan moved his entire world into the cavernous 2-story library of the manor. He claimed a massive oak desk as his throne, and from there, he managed the intricate politics of his pack. This forced Aria into his orbit, a silent, unwilling moon circling a smoldering sun. She would sit for hours in a worn armchair by the cold fireplace, a book open in her lap, though she never read a single word. The tension in the room was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating thing that made it hard to breathe. She was intensely aware of everything about him, the restless tap of his fingers on the desk, the low, frustrated growl that would sometimes rumble in his chest, the rich, intoxicating scent of pine and rage and thunderstorms that clung to him like a second skin. This forced closeness revealed a dangerous truth. Ronan's control, his iron-fisted grip on the beast within, was far more fragile than she had imagined. A call about a border dispute with a rival pack sent a wave of raw aggression rolling off him. The air grew thick and heavy, and she could see the struggle in the rigid line of his shoulders, in the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. His eyes began to glow with that feral golden light. The beast was close. Too close. Before she could think, a desperate, instinctual impulse took over. She stood up, crossed the space between them, and laid her hand gently on his forearm. The effect was like throwing a switch. The murderous tension flooding the room vanished in an instant. The low growl in his chest subsided into a confused rumble. He dropped the phone and his head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with shock. The golden blaze in their depths receded, leaving behind only the stunned, haunted man. He jerked his arm back as if her touch had burned him, a sharp hiss escaping his lips. But they both knew the truth. It hadn't burned him. It had soothed him. Her presence, her touch, was the only thing that could cage the monster he fought every single day. From that moment on, a perilous new dynamic was forged. He was still her captor, the source of her fear, but he was also becoming dependent on her in a way that terrified them both. The line between repulsion and attraction began to blur into a confusing, aching need. How could you hate the anchor that kept you from drifting away in a storm? How could you despise the only person in the world who could offer you a moment of quiet? His beast craved her, and her own dormant wolf, the one she'd thought long dead, was beginning to stir in response, drawn to the call of its other half. The constant emotional turmoil was exhausting, a battle that left her drained and hollowed out. One afternoon, curled in the armchair that had become her cage, she finally drifted off to sleep. But it was not a peaceful rest. She dreamed. She was running, her powerful legs eating up the ground, the scent of damp earth and moonlight filling her senses. Paws, not feet, thundered over the forest floor. She was a wolf, white as fresh snow. And she was not alone. A massive black wolf with burning, molten gold eyes ran at her side, their bodies moving in a perfect, joyful rhythm. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory that felt more real, more true, than the cold, waking world she was trapped in. She woke with a sharp gasp, her heart pounding, the phantom feeling of wind in her fur and the echo of a forgotten love aching in her soul. Chapter 8. The Silver and the Saint. The dream of the white wolf clung to Aria like a shroud, a beautiful and terrifying ghost. The feeling of running free, of a love so pure it was a physical force. It was a memory of a life she'd never lived. Or had she? The question haunted her, deepening the chasm of silence between her and Ronan. He seemed to feel the shift in her, too. His golden eyes would linger on her with a new, questioning intensity, as if he were seeing not just a human caretaker, but the ghost of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The invisible chain that bound them was no longer just a source of torment. It was humming with 1,000 unspoken questions. The answer, when it came, was delivered on a wave of violence. It happened during dinner, a tense, silent affair in the grand dining hall. Ronan, Aria, and a handful of his senior pack members, including the ever-watchful Cassian, were seated at the long, polished table. A servant poured Ronan a glass of deep red wine. He lifted it to his lips, and the world ended. He took one swallow and choked, a strangled, gagging sound that ripped through the silence. The glass shattered on the floor. He pitched forward, convulsing, his powerful body slamming against the table. "Silver!" someone hissed, a note of panic in their voice. Aria saw it instantly. His skin was taking on a sickly gray pallor, and a network of black spiderwebbing veins was spreading rapidly from his chest up his neck. Silver poisoning. For a werewolf, it was a death sentence, a fire that burned away their connection to their wolf, and then consumed the man. Chaos erupted. Guards shouted. Cassian stood frozen, his face a mask of shock, or perhaps calculation. Ronan was dying. He was writhing on the floor, his wolf howling in silent, unimaginable agony inside him. The bond, the golden leash, was screaming. It wasn't just his pain anymore, it was hers. It was a feedback loop of pure, undiluted agony that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. Driven by an instinct older than memory, she didn't run. She acted. She threw herself to the floor beside him, ignoring the shouts of the others. The dormant power inside her, the part that had flashed in her eyes and healed his beast with a touch, surged forward with the force of a tidal wave. She pressed her palms flat against his chest. A brilliant, warm, golden light exploded from her hands. It was not a gentle glow. It was a torrent of pure, raw life force. The pack members gasped, stumbling back in awe and terror. She felt the silver in his system, a cold, black, venomous thing, and she pushed against it with her light. She was taking his pain, filtering his poison through her own body, and it was an agony beyond description. But it was working. The black veins began to recede. His violent convulsions slowed. The beast within him, which had been fighting a losing battle, found a new anchor in her power and began to fight back. Just as the immediate danger passed, a faint, weak cry came from the head of the table. Alara. The shock, the terror, the violent surge of dark magic in the room, It had been too much for her fragile heart. Aria scrambled to her side, leaving Ronan unconscious but stable on the floor. The matriarch gripped her hand, her amber eyes, now cloudy with the approach of death, locked onto Aria's. He never understood, Ilara whispered, her voice a fragile, papery thing. The moon gives second chances, but only to the worthy. Her grip tightened for a moment, her gaze piercing. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. You, she breathed, her last word a puff of air, a final devastating secret. You were the one he lost. And then, the light in her beautiful amber eyes went out, leaving Aria kneeling in a room of death and magic, clutching a cold hand and a cryptic prophecy that had just rewritten her entire existence. Chapter 9. A memory of moonlight and ash grief was a sudden, suffocating vacuum in the room. Ilara was gone. Ronan was unconscious. The pack was a whirlwind of panic and suspicion, their gazes shifting between their fallen alpha and the strange human woman who glowed with impossible golden light. Aria knelt at the center of it all, a strange, quiet fulcrum in a world that had just been torn apart. The matriarch's final words were a brand on her soul. You were the one he lost. It was not a statement. It was an accusation, a key to a door she never knew existed. The words hammered against her mind, demanding an answer she did not have. The answer came for her. As she knelt there, her hand still holding Ilara's and her other resting on Ronan's chest to keep him stable, the raw magic of the moment acted as a catalyst. The near death of her other half, the passing of a soul who knew her secret, the full, untamed awakening of her own dormant power, it all converged. The world of polished wood and panicked whispers dissolved into a sea of white light. It was not a dream. It was not a vision. It was a memory, crashing over her with the force of a century of pain. She was not Aria. She was Lyra. Her body was light, powerful, and every inch of her hummed with a wild, joyful freedom. She was a wolf, her fur the color of freshly fallen snow under a full moon. The world was a symphony of scent and sound, and he was there. Ronan. Younger, his face unmarred by the deep lines of grief, his golden eyes bright with a love that was fierce and absolute. He was a magnificent black wolf, and they were mates, their souls tied together in a bond that felt as old and as essential as the stars above. She felt their love, a vibrant, living thing that made the world sing. They ran through ancient forests, a blur of black and white, two halves of a perfect whole. But a shadow fell over their moonlit world, a demand from his father, the old Alpha, an alliance with another pack, sealed by a betrothal, a duty that stood in direct opposition to their fated love. She felt Ronan's conflict, his torment. He was torn between tradition and his heart, and he made the wrong choice. The vision shifted. She was standing before him in a stone circle, the pack watching. He would not meet her eyes. He spoke the ancient words of severance, the brutal magical ritual of mate rejection. Each word was a physical blow, a blade that sliced through the beautiful, vibrant bond that connected them. She felt it tear. The pain was an apocalypse of the soul, a sundering so complete that the world lost all color, all sound, all meaning. Her wolf, the beautiful white creature of moonlight and freedom, could not survive it. It whimpered and died inside her, leaving a hollow, echoing void where her spirit used to be. She felt the last of her strength fade, the cold creeping in. Later, days, weeks, she saw herself fall in a border skirmish, a fight she would have once won with ease. But without her wolf, without her mate, she was just a shell. And the shell broke. Aria gasped, the vision snapping back into focus. She was herself again, kneeling on the cold floor of Vale Manor, but tears were streaming down her face, tears for a life she had never lived and a death she remembered perfectly. The memories were not someone else's. They were hers. The love, the betrayal, the agonizing death of her own wolf. She was Lyra, reborn into a human life as a cage, fated to find the very man whose choice had destroyed her. The curse wasn't on his family, it was his. And she was it. Just as this soul-shattering truth cemented itself, Ronan's eyelids fluttered open. He was weak, his breathing shallow, but his golden eyes were clear. He looked at her, at the raw, ancient grief etched onto her face, at the tears that were not for his mother, but for a loss far older. Through the bond, through her own surging power, he had seen it. A flash of it. A white wolf falling. A name whispered on the wind. He understood. Lyra, he breathed, the name a ragged, broken thing on his lips. His face, the face of the ruthless alpha, crumpled. All the anger, all the rage, all the cold distance was gone, replaced by a guilt so profound it was a physical wound. He didn't just lose his mate, he didn't just reject her, he had killed her, and she had come back. Chapter 10. The Ghost in the Kiss. The truth did not bring peace. It brought a heavier, more suffocating silence into the halls of Vale Manor. In the wake of his mother's death and the catastrophic return of his own memory, Ronan became a ghost. He was a creature of pure, self-inflicted torment, and the guilt radiated from him like a killing frost. He could barely look at Aria, because when he did, he saw not the quiet caretaker, but the white wolf he had sentenced to death. For Aria, the memories of Lyra settled into her bones, not as a weight, but as a core of forgotten steel. She felt the phantom ache of a love so deep it was a part of her, and the sharp, jagged edges of the betrayal that had destroyed it. Consequently, Ronan tried to push her away with a desperate, calculated cruelty. The bond was a physical chain, forcing them into the same orbit, so he used words as his weapons instead. You are a ghost that should have stayed buried, he snarled at her one afternoon in the library, the words tasting like ash in his own mouth. He saw her flinch, and a vicious, ugly part of him was glad, because her pain was a distraction from the all-consuming ocean of his own. He was trying to protect her, to drive her away from the man who had already proven he was her ruin. He believed he was a poison, a walking curse, and he would rather die than be the cause of her suffering a second time. But the woman he was speaking to was not the same one who had arrived at the manor weeks ago. The timid, broken caregiver had been burned away, and in her place, something of Lyra's wild spirit had taken root. The old Aria would have withered under his cruelty. The new Aria fought back. She found him in his father's old study in the West Wing, a room thick with the scent of old grief and whiskey. He was staring into the fireplace, a glass in his hand. His reflection a tormented stranger in the polished mantelpiece. Stop it, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't turn. Stop this pathetic display of self-pity. You know nothing, he growled, his back still to her. I know everything, she countered, stepping further into the room. I remember the wind in my fur and the feel of your heart beating next to mine. And I remember the look on your face when you chose a title over a soul. She saw his shoulders tense. She had struck a nerve. This guilt you're drowning in isn't for me, it's for you. You didn't just reject Lyra, Ronan. You rejected the best part of yourself. You chose duty. You chose obedience. And you have been a hollow man, a king of ghosts, ever since. You are not protecting me with this anger. You are a coward, hiding from the only thing that could ever make you whole. Her words were a key, unlocking a century of pent-up agony. He spun around, his face a mask of raw, untamed despair. All the grief for his mother, all the guilt for his mate, all the desperate, forbidden desire he had fought for years, crashed down in a single, unstoppable wave. He crossed the space between them in two long, desperate strides. This was not the mindless beast from the Great Hall, nor was he the cold, calculating alpha. He was just a man, broken and lost, and finally surrendering to the truth. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch not gentle, but a frantic, desperate anchor in a storm of his own making. The kiss was a collision. It wasn't soft or sweet. It was a desperate, brutal claiming, a clash of teeth and tongues and a century of unspoken need. It was the taste of whiskey and sorrow and a love that refused to die. It was punishment, and it was salvation. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her impossibly closer, while hers clutched at his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. For one breathtaking, terrifying moment, the man who grieved and the wolf that claimed were finally one, united in their shared, desperate hunger for her. They broke apart, gasping, their foreheads pressed together, the air thick and electric with the aftermath of the explosion. The kiss had solved nothing. It had only proven how deep the chasm was, and how impossible it was to ignore the bridge of fire that arced between them. Chapter 11. The Serpent's Return. The raw, fragile silence that followed the kiss was a world unto itself. In that small space between breaths, there was only the sound of their hearts hammering in unison, the scent of his skin, and the taste of his regret on her lips. It was a moment of pure, terrifying vulnerability, a truth spoken without a single word. But the moment, like all beautiful, fragile things, was destined to be shattered. Well, a voice as cool and sharp as breaking ice sliced through the intimacy. It seems the whispers around the pack were true after all. The ghost has returned to haunt the halls. Ronan reacted instantly, moving to place Aria partially behind him in a protective stance that was pure, undiluted instinct. A woman stood in the doorway, her beauty as severe and perfect as a marble statue. She was tall, her form draped in an elegant, dark gown that made her look like a queen of shadows. Her hair was the color of a moonless midnight, and her eyes, the shade of a winter sky, held a chilling, ancient intelligence. Aria knew her instantly. It was the face from her memories, the woman Ronan had been betrothed to, the duty he had chosen over his own soul. Seraphina. She moved into the study with the fluid, predatory grace of a panther, her presence instantly sucking the warmth from the air. Her gaze flickered to Ronan, a flicker of something possessive and old before it settled on Aria with a look of supreme condescending assessment. "I must admit, I'm surprised," she purred, her voice a silken weapon. "I never thought you'd be foolish enough to allow her back into your life. But then, your heart always was your greatest weakness." A low growl rumbled in Ronan's chest, a clear warning that Seraphina completely ignored. She was not afraid of him. She had a claim on him, a hold forged in politics and old laws, and she had come to inspect the threat to her position. "Leave, Seraphina," Ronan commanded, his voice tight with a dangerous calm that promised violence. "Oh, I will," she replied, her smile widening into something sharp and cruel. She circled around them, her movements deliberate, her gaze never leaving Aria. "I just came to ensure the little ghost understood the rules of her own haunting." She stopped directly in front of Aria, her expression one of mock pity that was more insulting than any open hostility. "Did you really think it would be so simple, that you could just die and come back and pick up where you left off?" Her words were sharp little cuts, designed to make Aria bleed. The old magic is not so forgiving. An alpha's rejection is a powerful, permanent thing. It leaves a mark, not on the skin, but on the soul itself. Aria felt Lyra's strength rise within her, a steady fire against the encroaching frost of Seraphina's presence. "I am not afraid of you." "Oh, you should be," Seraphina laughed, a sound with no humor in it, like the chime of broken glass. "Because you are a child playing with forces you cannot possibly comprehend. And he," she flicked a dismissive glance at Ronan, "is an emotional fool who is about to get you killed all over again." The statement hung in the air, a venomous promise, a hook baited with a terrible unspoken truth. Seraphina's smile was triumphant. She knew something they didn't, and she was going to enjoy telling them exactly what it was. Chapter 12. A vow of ash, Seraphina let the silence stretch, savoring the confusion and dawning fear on their faces. She was a grand performer, and this was her masterpiece of cruelty. She turned her attention fully to Ronan, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant for everyone in the room to hear. He hasn't told you the full truth, has he? He probably doesn't even know it himself. He was always so blinded by emotion, so driven by the beast. He never bothered to understand the magic he was wielding. She took a step closer, her winter sky eyes glittering with a malicious glee. The first rejection, the one that broke your precious bond all those years ago? The one that killed your wolf? She said, looking directly at Aria. That was a mercy. It only destroyed the animal part of you, leaving your pathetic human spirit to wither and die on its own. It scarred your soul, Lyra, leaving it fragile, brittle, like glass that has been shattered and poorly glued back together. The air grew thin, sharp, impossible to breathe. Aria could feel Ronan's entire body tense beside her, a statue of impending dread. He knew, on a primal level, that the words about to come would be his damnation. But to be claimed again? Serafina continued, her voice dripping with poison. For the same alpha to mark you with a full mating bite a second time? She shook her head, a look of faux sadness on her face that was utterly terrifying. That doesn't heal the old wound. Oh no. The magic is not so kind. The magic recognizes the scar. It sees the soul that has already been broken once by this exact same connection. She paused, letting the horror of her words sink in, twisting the knife. A second claiming, a second marking from the same source, would be too much for it to bear. It would be like striking that cracked mirror with a hammer. Her gaze finally locked with Ronan's, and she delivered the final devastating truth. It wouldn't just kill your wolf, she finished, her voice a triumphant, venomous whisper. It would shatter your very soul for eternity. There is no coming back from that, no more reincarnations, just oblivion. The world stopped. Ronan stared at Serafina, and then his gaze shifted to Aria, his face draining of all color. The one act that could complete him, the final sacred bite that would bind their souls together forever, was the very act that would annihilate her. Every possessive, primal instinct in his body was now a death sentence. The beast that wanted to claim her, the man that wanted to love her, they were both her executioner. His face, just moments ago filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope, was now a mask of absolute soul-crushing despair. Serafina smiled, her work done. She turned and walked out of the study without another word, leaving a nuclear winter in her wake. The silence she left behind was a tomb. Aria watched as Ronan took a stumbling step back from her, then another. The physical distance was nothing compared to the emotional chasm that was opening between them. His golden eyes, now filled with a horror so deep it looked like madness, flickered from her face to the faint silvery mark on her wrist. No, he whispered, the word a strangled, broken sound. He looked at her one last time, his expression completely shuttered, his heart barricaded behind a wall of impossible grief. I will not be your end. He turned and walked away, each footstep a hammer blow against her heart. I will never touch you again. The vow echoed in the empty room, a final, brutal rejection that was 1,000 times more painful than the first. Chapter 13, An Act of Mercy. Ronan's vow echoed in the silence his mother had left behind, a final nail in a coffin already sealed. I will never touch you again. In the days that followed, Vale Manor became a mausoleum for a love that was not allowed to live. The invisible chain of their bond, once a source of confusing heat and simmering tension, was now a conduit for pure, undiluted agony. He kept his word. He did not touch her, speak to her, or even look at her. Yet he was always there, a thundercloud of misery in the library, a brooding shadow in the dining hall, a ghost whose pain was a constant screaming noise in her soul. Aria watched him waste away. It was a slow, deliberate act of self-destruction. The vibrant gold of his eyes, the color of sunlight and power, dulled to the shade of old, tarnished brass. The confident, predatory grace of his movements vanished, replaced by a weary, heavy tread. He was starving the beast inside him, and the man was dying right along with it. She could feel his wolf's frantic, desperate clawing against the bars of its cage through the mark on her wrist. It was a constant, maddening pulse of need and despair that was not her own, but had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. He was erasing himself, moment by painful moment, all to keep her safe from a fate he had already sealed a lifetime ago. The realization settled in her heart with the cold, heavy weight of a gravestone. Her presence was not a comfort, it was the poison. Being so close to the mate he could never claim was the torment that was unraveling him. Her scent, her proximity, the constant pull of their broken bond, it was a torture far crueler than any blade. And she loved him. The truth of it was a quiet, undeniable ache in her chest. She loved the memory of the wild wolf. She loved the broken man he was now, and she knew with a certainty that terrified her that she could not be the reason for his end. Therefore, she made a choice born of that desperate, consuming love. She would be the one to show him mercy, even if he wouldn't show it to himself. She had to leave. Perhaps, with enough distance, the bond would finally fray and break. She would gladly take the physical agony of the severing upon herself, if it meant he could finally find some semblance of peace. His wolf would sleep, and maybe, just maybe, the man could learn to live again. It was a sacrifice she had to make. Under the cloak of a moonless, starless night, she moved through the sleeping manor. She left a single sheet of paper on the massive oak desk in the library, a final, silent message. One word was written on it, a word that felt like a lie and a prayer all at once: mercy. Then she ran. The first 100 feet away from the house were agony. The mark on her wrist exploded, a searing fire that shot up her arm and into her chest. It was the feeling of her soul being stretched to its breaking point. She pushed through it, biting back a scream, her vision tunneling. She stumbled into the dark, tangled woods, each step away from him an act of sheer, brutal will. The pain was a living thing, a monster trying to drag her back. But she kept going, driven by the image of his dull, dying eyes. Finally, her strength gave out. She collapsed in a small, hidden clearing, her body convulsing, the magical backlash a white-hot fire in her veins. She lay there, gasping in the cold night air, and for a moment a sliver of tragic peace settled over her. She had done it. She had set him free. Chapter 14. The Howl and the Hunt. For a few precious seconds, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart against the cold, damp earth. The pain from the bond was an inferno in her veins, but beneath it, there was a quiet she mistook for peace. The quiet of a cage door swinging open, the quiet of a chain finally broken. She had been so wrong. The silence was not peace. It was the breath a predator takes before it strikes. The bond didn't just stretch and fray, it snapped. The psychic backlash was a cataclysm. It wasn't a slow fizzle, but a violent, explosive severance that sent a shockwave of pure agony through her soul. She felt his control shatter. She felt the beast, starved and enraged and driven mad by the sudden, violent absence of its mate, finally break free from its cage of flesh and bone. There was no man left. There was only a hurricane of pure, mindless rage, and it was focused entirely on the source of its pain. On her. Then came the sound. It started deep within the stone walls of the manor and tore its way out into the night. It was a howl, but it was no animal cry. It was a sound of damnation, a raw, terrifying roar of loss and fury and a soul being ripped in two. It echoed through the silent woods, shaking the very leaves on the trees, a promise of the violence to come. And Aria knew, with a terror that was absolute and paralyzing, that he was coming for her. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through her pain-induced haze. She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking, every instinct screaming at her to run. The forest, which had been her path to freedom just moments before, was now a deadly, tangled trap. She plunged deeper into the woods, branches whipping at her face, her bare feet stumbling over unseen roots. She could hear him now, not just with her ears, but with every fiber of her being. She could feel the ground trembling with the force of his pursuit. He wasn't running like a man. He was moving with the impossible, terrifying speed of a monster unleashed. The hunt was on. The woods became a blur of dark, menacing shapes. Every shadow looked like him. Every snap of a twig sounded like his approach. Her lungs burned, a fire that was a pale imitation of the agony still radiating from her wrist. She was no match for him. She was prey, and the predator was closing in with a speed that defied nature. He was not hunting her to bring her back. He was hunting her with the mindless, destructive fury of a force of nature, a storm that seeks only to destroy the thing that gave it birth. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw it, a flicker of movement between the trees, a blur of darkness moving faster than her mind could process. Hope died. There was no escape. She burst through a final line of trees into the small, moonlit clearing she had collapsed in just minutes before and stumbled to a halt. There was nowhere left to run. She turned, her back pressing against the rough bark of an ancient oak, and waited for the end. A second later, he crashed through the undergrowth at the far side of the clearing, a terrifying broken figure, his chest heaving, his golden eyes blazing with a light that was utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. Chapter 15. Under the Blood Moon. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a creature caught between two worlds. He was not the cold, controlled alpha, nor was he the mindless, raging beast she had expected. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had been pushed past the absolute limit of his soul. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his clothes torn from his frantic chase through the woods. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths. The feral, inhuman light in his eyes was banked by a pain so profound, so utterly human that it stole the air from her lungs. He didn't charge. He didn't snarl. He simply broke. His powerful body crumpled, and he fell to his knees in the damp grass, his head bowed. The sight of his surrender was more shocking than any act of violence could have been. He wasn't here to hurt her. He was here because he couldn't exist without her. "Don't you see?" he gasped, his voice a raw, shattered whisper that barely carried across the clearing. He looked up and his golden eyes were filled with a beautiful, terrifying vulnerability. "The pain of having you near, of never being able to touch you. It is a heaven compared to the hell of you being gone." He crawled the last few feet toward her, not as a predator, but as a penitent. His hands hovered just inches from her, trembling with the sheer, monumental effort it took not to touch, not to bridge the gap that he himself had created. "They were wrong," he choked out, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek, a drop of liquid silver in the moonlight. The rejection. It didn't just kill Lyra's wolf, it killed the man. "I have been a ghost for 100 years, Aria." His eyes, raw and pleading, locked on hers, and in their depths, she saw the devastating truth of his words. "I will not die twice." In that moment, everything became clear. Her act of mercy had been nothing but a different kind of execution. Her choice was not between his sanity and her freedom. It was between a shared life of pain or a separate death of the soul for both of them, and she would not let him die again. Not for anything. The last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a fierce, defiant love. She had made a choice once, driven by a misguided attempt to save him. Now, she would make another. Slowly, she closed the small distance between them. She reached out her trembling hand and laced her fingers through his. The instant their skin touched, a jolt of pure, raw energy, a current of defiant magic, surged between them. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a wildfire. It was the feeling of two broken halves of a soul slamming back together with a force that shook the very foundations of the world. It was the feeling of choosing damnation together. It was the feeling of coming home. A strange, unnatural light began to fill the clearing. They both looked up instinctively, their hands still clasped together in a desperate, unbreakable grip. The thick clouds that had blanketed the sky were being torn apart as if by an unseen, angry hand. High in the sky, the moon was revealed, but it was not the gentle silver of hope or the pale white of memory. It was a deep, sickening, blood red. The color of a curse, awakened at last by their defiance. Chapter 16. The Crimson Tide. The moment their hands touched, the moment their defiant choice was made, the sky bled. The moon, a perfect silver orb just seconds before, was now a malevolent, crimson eye staring down at them, bathing the forest clearing in a ghastly red light. It was not a natural phenomenon, it was a judgment. A wave of cold, corrupting power washed over them, and Ronan screamed. It was not a sound of rage or challenge. It was the sound of a soul being flayed, a pure, unadulterated agony that ripped from his throat and tore through the night. The bond, the beautiful, terrible thing that connected them, became a conduit for his torment. Aria felt the curse try to seep into her through the mark on her wrist, a venomous, icy power that sought to devour her own reawakened spirit. Ronan felt it too. With the last vestiges of his human will, he tried to shove her away. "Run!" he choked out, his body beginning to convulse violently. "Get away from me!" But she couldn't. Her hand was fused to his, not by his grip, but by the very magic that was now destroying him. His transformation was a grotesque mockery of a shifter's change. It was not the swift, powerful unfolding of a wolf, but a painful, horrifying warping of flesh and bone. His skeleton cracked and reformed, his muscles tearing and reshaping themselves under his skin. He was growing, swelling into something monstrously large, his screams turning into the wet, guttural sounds of a creature being born in blood and pain. This was not the moon's gift. This was her curse. He was not becoming a wolf. He was being remade into a monster, a vessel for the blood moon's rage. Aria could only watch in frozen terror as the man she loved was erased before her very eyes. His skin split and fur sprouted, not the magnificent black of Lyra's memories, but a coarse, matted coat the color of dried blood and old iron. His features elongated into a snarling, demonic snout, his teeth becoming long, jagged shards of bone. He was a nightmare given form, a creature designed for one purpose: to kill. Finally, the agonizing transformation was complete. The thing that stood before her was half again as large as any wolf she had ever seen, its body a twisted caricature of muscle and malice. It raised its massive head to the sky, and its eyes opened. They were not the molten gold of the alpha, the color of sunlight and soul. They were glowing with the same malevolent red as the moon above. And in their depths, there was nothing. No recognition, no memory, no Ronan. There was only a cold, bottomless hunger and a terrifying, absolute possessiveness. It looked down at her, its head cocked, not with curiosity, but with the unthinking instinct of a predator identifying its property. It had no memory of loving her, only a corrupted, undeniable urge to own her, to guard her, and to destroy anything that came near. The monster that was once Ronan Vale let out a roar that was a perversion of a howl, a sound of pure damnation that promised a new and terrible kind of suffering was about to begin. Chapter 17. The Monster's Cage. The forest clearing became Aria's cage, and the monster her warden. The creature that wore Ronan's face did not harm her. It did something far more terrifying. It simply existed, a constant circling sentinel of silent, red-eyed devotion. It would not let her leave the clearing, herding her back with a low, rumbling growl if she strayed too close to the trees. It brought her food, the bloody, mangled carcasses of deer and rabbits, and laid them at her feet like offerings. At night, it would lie down a few feet away, its massive body a wall between her and the rest of the world, its glowing red eyes never leaving her for a second. This was not protection. It was imprisonment. She was the monster's treasure, a doll in a cage of teeth and claws. By the second day, the pack found them. Cassian, his silver hair immaculate even in the grim reality of the cursed forest, led a party of 5 of the strongest pack warriors. They saw the monstrous beast, saw the blood-matted fur and the soulless red eyes, and their faces hardened with a grim, terrible resolve. They saw their alpha, lost and gone, and they saw the human woman they believed was the cause of it all. "Aria!" Cassian shouted from a safe distance. "Move away from it! We are here to put it down." Aria shook her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No, it's still him." "That is not your alpha," another warrior snarled, his hand already beginning to shift, his fingernails elongating into claws. "That is an abomination." They took a step forward, a coordinated, threatening movement. That was their mistake. The beast at Aria's feet had been resting, a coiled spring of dormant violence. The warrior's advance triggered its one, overriding directive: protect the possession. It rose to its full, terrifying height and launched itself forward with a speed that was a blur of motion. The attack was not a fight, it was a slaughter. The creature moved with none of a wolf's tactical grace. It was a hurricane of claws and fangs, a mindless engine of destruction. It tore through the first warrior before he could even complete his shift, a single brutal swipe of its claws disemboweling him. The forest clearing turned into a canvas of blood and screams. The remaining warriors tried to fight, to flank the beast, but they were facing a force of pure, untamed rage. The monster moved through them, its powerful jaws snapping bones, its claws tearing through flesh with sickening ease. It felt no pain, showed no fear, registered no strategy. It simply eliminated every threat that dared to come near Aria. Within a minute, it was over. 2 more warriors lay dead, their bodies twisted and broken. Cassian and the one remaining survivor scrambled back into the woods, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. The beast, panting, its snout drenched in the blood of its own pack, trotted back to Aria. It nudged her hand with its wet nose before settling back at her feet, its red eyes once again fixed on her with that terrifying, unthinking devotion. Aria stared at the carnage, at the bodies of men who had followed Ronan, and a cold, sickening realization washed over her. Cassian was right. They would come back, and they would come back with silver and with fire. They would hunt this beast down and kill it. Her choice was now stark and simple. She could let them kill the monster and the man inside it, or she could find another way, a way that might cost her more than just her life. Chapter 18. The Second Death of the Wolf. The choice was a blade with 2 edges, and both of them promised to cut her to the bone. Let them kill the monster, and Ronan would die with it, his soul lost forever to the curse. Or she could try to save him, but how? There was no reasoning with the red-eyed beast. It was a mindless slave to the Blood Moon's magic, and she was the anchor that chained it to this world. The curse was feeding on their bond, twisting the pure, fated connection of 2 mates into a corrupting fuel for its rage. The only way to starve the curse was to cut off its food source. The only way to save him was to destroy the very thing that made them whole. She remembered the vision. She remembered the agony of the rejection, the magical severing that had killed Lyra's wolf and shattered her spirit. A rejection had destroyed her once. Now, she wondered, with a heart full of cold, desperate dread, if a sacrifice could be his salvation. It was a terrible, desperate gamble. She had to do it herself. She had to reach into her own soul, find the beautiful, wild spirit of the white wolf she had only just rediscovered, and kill it. Knowingly. Willingly. She sat down in the grass, the monster resting its massive head on her lap, its red eyes blinking slowly. It trusted her, in its own mindless, possessive way. Closing her eyes, Aria turned her focus inward, away from the blood and the fear, and deep into the core of her own being. She found it there, a nascent, flickering flame of pure, silver light. It was Lyra's spirit, her wolf, the part of her that remembered freedom and moonlight and joy. It was her strength, her power, her very identity, and she had to extinguish it. This was not a physical act. It was a spiritual suicide. She gathered all of her will, all of her love for the broken man trapped inside the beast, and she used it as a weapon against herself. She reached for that beautiful silver flame and began to smother it. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known. It was the feeling of light turning to ash, of a symphony being silenced note by excruciating note. It was the memory of running through the forest fading to black. It was the feeling of her own soul being hollowed out, leaving an empty, echoing void where life used to be. She was killing the best part of herself to save him. As the last flicker of Lyra's spirit died, a great, shuddering tremor ran through the beast. The malevolent red light in its eyes flickered and went out, replaced for a single, fleeting second by the familiar, confused gold of Ronan's own. The corrupting power of the curse, its anchor to their bond now severed, had nowhere to go. It dissipated into the air like smoke. The monstrous form convulsed, shrinking, bones snapping and reforming, fur receding into pale human skin. It collapsed in the clearing, no longer a monster, but a naked, unconscious man. High above, the blood-red moon faded, returning to a cool, indifferent silver. The curse was broken. Aria, now an empty shell, a woman hollowed out by her own sacrifice, looked down at the man she had just saved. The forest was silent. The last vestiges of the white wolf, of Lyra, of the woman she was meant to be, faded from her forever, leaving only the cold, quiet grief of what she had just done. He was alive. He was human. And she was empty. Chapter 19. A Debt of Blood and Ash. The first thing to return was the pain, not the clean fire of a magical bond, but the dull, ragged agony of a limb that has been torn away. Ronan woke to the taste of blood and the soul-deep, echoing emptiness where Aria used to be. The world came back in brutal, jagged pieces, the cold, damp earth beneath his naked body, the metallic scent of death hanging heavy in the air, and the crushing, absolute weight of memory. He saw it all. He remembered the red haze of the curse, the mindless, possessive rage, and the sickening, wet sound of his claws tearing through the flesh of his own packmates. He scrambled to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and saw them. The bodies. The men who had followed him, slaughtered by his own hand. A guttural sob of pure self-loathing ripped from his throat. The bond was gone. It was a phantom limb, an ache in his soul that was a constant, horrifying reminder of its absence. He could not feel her anymore. He could only feel the void she had left behind. In the mud, he saw a single set of small, bare footprints leading away from the clearing and into the darkness. She was gone, and he knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in his gut, that he had to find her. As if summoned by his waking, Cassian and the two other surviving warriors emerged from the tree line, their faces grim, their stances wary. They looked at him, at their naked, blood-splattered alpha, with eyes full of fear and accusation. "It is over," Cassian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The curse is broken." "Where is she?" Ronan's voice was a raw, broken rasp. "She walked away," the other warrior answered. "Just walked, like a ghost. We did not stop her." Ronan nodded, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. He was their alpha. This was his fault. All of it. "Their families will be cared for," he stated, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "This debt is mine to pay." He pushed past them, his focus singular, his entire being narrowed down to one purpose: finding Aria. He returned to the manor, a ghost in his own home, the silence a screaming accusation. On the desk in the library, he found her note. One word: mercy. The paper crumpled in his fist. This wasn't mercy. This was a sacrifice. She hadn't run from him. She had offered up her own soul for him. Driven by a desperate, gnawing suspicion, he went to his mother's private chambers, a place he hadn't entered since her death. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt his mother's presence there, her quiet, calculating love. Tucked away beneath a false bottom in her jewelry box, he found it. A small, leather-bound journal. His mother's elegant script filled the pages, but she wasn't writing about her life. She was writing about his. He read about a trip she had taken decades ago after Lyra's death, to a blind seer deep in the northern mountains. He read the seer's prophecy, that a soul torn by a fated rejection could be granted one chance at rebirth by the moon. And he read the final devastating entry, dated just 2 months ago. The seer was right. I have found her, a caregiver named Aria. I will bring her here. Fate must do the rest. May the goddess forgive me for the suffering I am about to cause, but I will not let my son live as a ghost for one more day. The journal slipped from his fingers. It was not chance. It was not an accident. His mother had known all along. She had orchestrated everything. Chapter 20. The Fading Flame. The revelation that his mother had orchestrated their meeting was not a comfort. It was a fire that burned away the last of his self-pity. He was not a victim of fate. He had been a blind, grief-stricken fool, and his ignorance had cost Aria everything. His mother's gamble had brought Aria back into his life, but his own weakness and the resurrected curse had hollowed her out, leaving her an empty shell. He now understood the chilling truth. A soul without its wolf, its anima, could not survive for long in a world of magic. It would simply fade, like a candle flame starved of air. Aria wasn't just gone. She was dying. He abandoned the house, the Alpha's duties, the grieving pack. All of it was meaningless without her. He ran into the forest, not with the mindless rage of the beast, but with the desperate focus of a hunter trying to find the last embers of a dying fire. He could no longer feel her through the bond, but he could still track her. He followed the faint, fading scent of night-blooming jasmine and ozone, a scent that was growing weaker with every passing hour, a ghost on the wind. It led him to a place he hadn't seen since he was a child, a small, crumbling stone chapel deep in the oldest part of the Vale Woods, a forgotten place of worship for the ancient moon goddess. He found her inside. She was sitting on a cold stone pew, her back to him, staring at the shattered stained glass window that depicted a silver moon. She was so still, so quiet, he thought for a terrifying moment, that he was too late. Aria, he whispered, his voice cracking. She didn't turn. She didn't seem to have the strength. He walked around the pew and knelt before her, and his heart broke. The vibrant, stubborn life that had burned in her eyes was gone. They were dull, empty windows into a hollowed-out soul. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely visible. I know, he began, his voice thick with a grief that was 1,000 years old. I know everything. He took her cold, limp hand in his, and he confessed it all. He told her about his mother's journal, about the seer's prophecy, about the desperate, loving manipulation that had brought her to his door. It was never an accident, he choked out, tears he hadn't shed in a century finally falling. It was always you. My mother knew. She brought you here, hoping that I would be strong enough to see past my own pain. But I wasn't. A single slow tear tracked its way down her pale cheek. It was the only sign that she had heard him. She was fading, her connection to the world fraying with every passing second. He knew there was only one chance left, a final, desperate gamble that would make his mother's look tame. There is a way, he said, his voice dropping, his golden eyes locking on her empty ones, trying to will a spark of life back into them. An old ritual, forbidden. It's called the anima vinculum, the soul bond. It can reignite a dormant wolf spirit, but the price is high. It requires the Alpha to offer his own life force, his own soul as fuel. It could kill us both, Aria. He squeezed her hand, a desperate final plea. But I will not lose you again. Not now. Not ever. Please, Trust me. One last time." For a long, terrifying moment, there was nothing. Then slowly, so faintly he almost missed it, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Chapter 21. The Alpha's Offering. Hope, terrifying and fragile, flared in Ronan's chest. Her faint nod was all the permission he needed. He gently lifted her, her body feeling as light and fragile as a bird's, and carried her to the center of the ruined chapel, laying her down before the crumbling stone altar. Time was running out. He could feel her life force, a flickering, guttering candle flame, about to be extinguished forever. The anima vinculum was a ritual of pure, primal magic, a desperate appeal to the ancient goddess of their people. It was a trade, a soul for a soul. He knelt beside her and unsheathed the small silver knife he always carried. Without hesitation, he drew the blade across his own palm. Blood, dark and rich with his alpha power, welled up, and he began to draw. Using his own lifeblood as ink, he painted the ancient runes of the ritual onto the cold stone floor around her body. The rune of the wolf, the rune of the soul, and the rune of sacrifice. The air in the chapel grew thick, heavy with a power that was as old as the moon itself. The final step was the most dangerous. He pressed his bleeding palm to her chest, directly over her heart. Then, he closed his eyes and reached inside himself. He called upon the spirit of his own wolf, the ancient, powerful beast that was the heart of his alpha strength, and commanded it to do the impossible. He began to pour his own life essence, his own soul, out of his body and into hers. The feeling was immediate and agonizing. It was the feeling of being emptied, of his own inner fire being drained away, leaving a creeping, deathly cold in its place. He pushed his energy into her, and what he found inside was a vast, silent, echoing void. It was the empty space where her wolf, where Lyra, used to be. The darkness was absolute, and it threatened to swallow his own spirit whole. He pushed harder, pouring more and more of himself into the emptiness, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. He was fading fast, his vision tunneling, the cold creeping up his limbs. It wasn't working. The void was too great. His life force was simply dissipating into the darkness. He was giving her everything, and it wasn't enough. She was still fading, and now so was he. Despair, cold and final, began to close in. In a final, desperate act, he realized that power was not enough. The void could not be filled with strength alone. It had to be filled with what had been stolen from it. He stopped trying to push his wolf spirit into her, and instead he reached for the one thing that was purely his. He reached for his oldest, most sacred memory. He offered up the pure, untainted image of the white wolf, Lyra, running beside him under a silver moon, the feeling of their joyous, unbroken bond. He offered up the soul-deep love he felt for her in that moment, before his fear and his duty had turned him into a monster. And then, he offered up the searing, 100-year-old agony of his regret. He offered his love and his pain as the final fuel for the fire. That was the key. Deep within the void inside her, the pure, emotional offering found its mark. A tiny, impossibly small ember flickered to life. The last, dying remnant of Lyra's spirit. His magic now had a target. It rushed toward the ember, fanning it from a spark to a flicker, and then to a soft silver flame. A faint, beautiful silver light began to emanate from her chest, pushing back the darkness. He felt a weak, tentative pulse from her spirit wolf, a single, questioning beat against his own fading heart. As he collapsed from the strain, his last ounce of strength gone, Aria took a sharp, sudden, ragged breath. Her eyes, still closed, fluttered. He looked up through the shattered roof of the chapel, his vision blurring. High above, the moon, which had been a normal, indifferent silver, was now shining with a pure, brilliant, impossible white light. It was a light of absolution, a light of rebirth. Chapter 22. A Soul for a Soul. Ronan's world dissolved into a pinprick of fading white light. He had poured everything he was, his strength, his memories, his very soul, into the vast, silent darkness inside of Aria. He felt the last of his energy gutter and fail, the cold of oblivion a welcoming, peaceful blanket. He had done all he could. His final thought was of a white wolf running free under a silver moon, and it was enough. He was dying, but for the first time in a century, he was not dying alone. He was a soul for a soul. The trade was made, but he was wrong. A trade was not what the magic demanded. Aria's first breath was a sharp, ragged gasp that pulled her back from the edge of a great, quiet nothingness. The world rushed back in a symphony of sensation, the cold stone beneath her, the scent of damp earth and old magic, and the heavy, fading weight of the man lying over her. Her eyes fluttered open. They were no longer the empty, haunted windows of a hollowed-out woman. A new light shone within them, a brilliant, impossible fusion of her own warm brown, Lyra's shimmering silver, and the molten gold she had taken from him. She was whole. She was more. She felt him then, truly felt him. His life was a faint, flickering ember, about to be extinguished by his own sacrifice. She saw the blood-drawn runes around them, felt the remnants of the ancient ritual, and her reborn wolf, her anima, knew instantly what he had done. And it knew what she had to do. He had tried to trade his life for hers, a noble but foolish gesture. The ritual didn't demand a sacrifice. It demanded balance. With a surge of strength that was both new and ancient, she placed her hand over his, pressing his bleeding palm more firmly against her heart. "No," she whispered, her voice a low, powerful hum that vibrated with her restored spirit. "Not your soul for mine. Our souls. Together." She reversed the flow. It was no longer him pouring his life into her, but a circuit being completed. She pushed the brilliant, vibrant life force that now flooded her veins back into him. It was not a trade. It was a merging. In the space between heartbeats, their spirits met. His magnificent black wolf, weary and half-faded, met her brilliant white wolf, newly reborn and blazing with light. They did not circle or fight. They moved toward each other, two galaxies of soul stuff and intertwined. Black and white, shadow and light, masculine and feminine, rage and mercy, all of it swirled together, creating a new, perfectly balanced whole. The old jagged scar on Lyra's soul from the first rejection was washed away in a tide of shared love. The taint of the blood moon's curse was burned away by the pure white light of their unified spirits. A massive, silent pulse of pure white energy exploded from their joined hands. It was not a violent force, but a wave of pure, cleansing magic. It washed over the crumbling chapel walls, breathing life into the dead stone. It rolled out into the forest, causing sleeping seeds to sprout and ancient trees to sigh with relief. The curse that had plagued the Vale lands for 100 years was not just broken. It was erased, unmade. In the aftermath, in the sudden, peaceful quiet, they both collapsed, their bodies finally succumbing to the strain. They lay unconscious in the circle of faded runes, his hand still resting over her heart, their souls finally, truly, and eternally bound as one. Chapter 23. The Kneeling of the Pack. Cassian approached the ruined chapel with the caution of a wolf stepping on uncertain ice. He and the rest of the pack had seen the silent explosion of white light from the forest's edge, a celestial event that had felt like the world taking its first clean breath in a century. The heavy, oppressive energy that had clung to the Vale lands for as long as any of them could remember, the curse, the rage, the grief, was simply gone. The very air felt different, lighter, full of the clean, crisp scent of new life. He peered into the chapel and froze. The scene before him was one of quiet reverence. The crumbling stone walls seemed less decayed, with small white moonflowers already beginning to sprout from the cracks. In the center of the floor, surrounded by the faint, ghostly outlines of faded runes, lay their alpha and the woman, Aria. They were unconscious, but their breathing was deep and even, their faces peaceful. They were not just alive. They were whole, in a way Cassian had never seen his alpha be before. The raw, violent edge to Ronan's power was gone, replaced by a deep, steady calm that was more commanding than any roar. Slowly, the rest of the pack gathered behind him, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning understanding. They had been prepared for a final, bloody battle to put down a monster. They had not been prepared for a miracle. They waited, silent and watchful, as the first rays of dawn streamed through the shattered stained glass window, painting the scene in hues of rose and gold. Ronan and Aria awoke at the same time, as if drawn from the same dream. The first thing Ronan felt was not the cold stone or the ache in his body, but the bond. It was a warm, steady, and perfectly balanced connection, a quiet hum of love and peace that resonated in the very core of his soul. He was not just connected to her, he was a part of her, and she a part of him. He looked at Aria, and she looked at him, and in that shared gaze, 100 years of pain was finally laid to rest. Her eyes, now a permanent, breathtaking silver gold, held the wisdom of 2 lifetimes and the strength of a love that had conquered death itself. They rose together, supporting each other, 2 pillars of a new, unbreakable arch. When they emerged from the chapel into the soft morning light, the entire pack was there, waiting. A tense silence fell over the clearing. Every eye was on them, on their alpha who was no longer a haunted king, and on the woman who was so much more than a human caregiver. Cassian, the proud, pragmatic wolf who had once been Ronan's greatest rival, looked at the undeniable power and peace radiating from them. He saw the way Ronan looked at Aria, not with the maddening possession of the beast, but with the profound reverence of a man who has found his soul. He saw the quiet, unshakable strength in Aria's gaze, the bearing of a queen. In a gesture that stunned the entire pack and solidified the dawn of a new era, Cassian dropped to one knee. "Alpha," he said, his voice clear and steady, his head bowed. Then, he lifted his gaze to Aria, and in his eyes was a look of profound, hard-won respect. Luna. One by one, like a wave of surrender and fealty, the other warriors followed his lead. The entire pack knelt in the morning light before the man who had redeemed himself and the woman who had saved them all. Chapter 24. Where the Moonflowers Bloom. 6 months later, the Vale estate was a place transformed. The oppressive gloom that had clung to the stones for a century had been replaced by sunlight and the sound of laughter. The pack was healing, thriving under the balanced, steady leadership of their Alpha and Luna. The curse was a memory, a dark fairy tale told to remind them of the true meaning of sacrifice and the redemptive power of a love that refused to die. They stood together on a gentle slope overlooking the valley, before a simple, elegant headstone of white marble that read, Elara Vale, a loving mother, a patient heart. The grave was not a place of sorrow. It was a garden, overflowing with hundreds of blooming white moonflowers, their petals like captured starlight even in the daylight. They were a sign, a final gift from a mother whose desperate gamble had finally, beautifully paid off. Ronan placed a fresh white rose on the grave, his hand resting beside one of the blossoms. "She would have loved this," he said, his voice quiet, full of a peace he had never known. "She would have loved you." Aria leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. The bond between them was a constant, gentle warmth, a silent conversation that never ended. "She knew," Aria whispered. "She knew that a heart like yours was never meant to be a ghost." He turned to face her, his golden eyes clear and full of a love so deep it was a physical presence. He was no longer the haunted man, the king of a broken past. He was simply Ronan. And she was no longer the hollowed-out caregiver, the woman running from her own soul. She was Aria. She was Lyra. She was whole. The core emotional question that had haunted their every step, can love still save a man whose wolf no longer knows mercy, had finally been answered. His wolf had not needed to learn mercy from her. It had only needed to be reminded of the love it had never truly forgotten. My mother gave me a second chance at life, Ronan said, his voice thick with emotion as he gently cupped her face. But you gave me back my soul. Aria smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her silver gold eyes. She raised her hand to his cheek, her touch a final, perfect absolution. You didn't just save me, Ronan, she whispered, the words a perfect echo of the truth in both their hearts. You saved the part of you that never stopped loving me. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that held no desperation, no sorrow, only the quiet, unshakable promise of all the sunrises to come. As they stood together under the vast, peaceful sky, he gently touched the spot on her wrist where the bite mark had once been. The skin was smooth and unblemished, but just beneath the surface, a faint silvery gold light pulsed with the steady rhythm of her heart, a perfect match to the light that now glowed faintly beneath his own skin. The bond was no longer a scar or a brand. It was a part of them, as natural and as essential as breathing. The wolf, at long last, was at rest.